Congratulations, Brenda. In the end, you were always good at signing your name and letting others make the decisions for you." The sound of Richard Sullivan's sarcastic applause echoed throughout the New York law office like a sharp, ringing slap. "Congratulations, Brenda," he repeated with that smug smile he had perfectly cultivated over their 12 years of marriage. "Finally, you make a smart choice. Sign the divorce papers and accept what I am offering you without putting up a fight like other women would." Brenda Foster, 39 years old, with her dark hair pulled back into an immaculate bun and wearing the navy blue dress he had always deemed appropriate for a wife of his status, calmly looked down at the documents and signed the final page. She was giving up the beautiful house in Brooklyn Heights, keeping only one of their 2 cars, and accepting a financial settlement that Richard claimed would keep her dignified for a few years. After all, Richard continued, as he tucked his copy of the paperwork into his expensive Italian leather briefcase, "It is not as if you have any real options left. You stopped working years ago to support my career, and without my network or my standard of living, you would be lost. Well, it is best that you accept reality." Dr. Harrison, his lawyer, smiled with deep satisfaction. Paige Miller, Brenda's attorney, remained entirely silent, her facial expression completely unreadable. "I have a meeting in 30 minutes, Richard announced, proudly checking his luxury gold watch. "It is a massive contract with Preston Mitchell, the millionaire transport magnate, and it is going to be the most important business deal of my entire career." He walked toward the heavy oak door. "See you around, Brenda. Do not worry, you will be fine. Women like you always find another man to foot the bills." The heavy office door clicked shut behind him. Brenda waited exactly 10 seconds before pulling her cellular phone from her purse. A message was waiting on the glowing screen. "Miss Foster, your executive jet is fueled and ready for takeoff at Teterboro Airport at 6 o'clock this evening. The corporate investors from Chicago have confirmed tomorrow's meeting," wrote Captain Reynolds. Paige Miller looked over at her client, a genuine smile finally breaking through her strict professional demeanor. "How much time do you honestly think it will take for him to discover that Preston Mitchell abruptly canceled their afternoon meeting?" Brenda calmly tucked the phone away and stood up gracefully. "Probably right around the time he tries to demand an explanation from the transport millionaire and learns that his ex-wife is actually the sole owner of Aero Foster International." The November rain tapped rhythmically against the glass windows of the 24th floor of the Wall Street Tower, but Brenda Foster barely heard the storm outside. Her deep brown eyes, which Richard had once affectionately compared to her grandmother's chocolate fudge, remained fixed on the legal documents resting on the table. The crisp white pages, covered in tiny print and complex legal jargon, officially represented the absolute end of her 12-year marriage. Her delicate yet steady hands held a luxury fountain pen, a gift from her former mother-in-law during much happier times. The prestigious law firm smelled strongly of expensive polished mahogany, fine leather upholstery, and freshly brewed artisanal coffee, a scent that characterized places where monumental decisions were made in New York City. The antique furniture gleamed brightly under the artificial recessed lighting, and the walls were covered with framed degrees and photographs of the partners shaking hands with prominent politicians and elite businessmen. Brenda had been in powerful rooms just like this countless times throughout her hidden career, but she had never experienced circumstances quite this intensely personal. Sitting across from her, separated by a massive conference table large enough to comfortably seat 12 people, was Richard Sullivan. Her soon-to-be ex-husband wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that Brenda knew cost more money than many hard-working American families earned in 6 months. His brown hair, perfectly slicked back with imported styling gel, did not have a single strand out of place. At 43 years of age, Richard maintained the polished appearance he had carefully cultivated since his university days at Harvard Business School, projecting the aura of a man born exclusively for high-level success. His striking blue eyes, a genetic gift from an Italian great-grandmother who arrived in the United States early in the 20th century, gleamed with a toxic satisfaction that Brenda recognized all too well. It was the exact same expression he wore whenever he closed a ruthless business deal or successfully forced a desperate competitor completely out of the market. Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair like a triumphant king upon his throne, crossing his arms over his chest while offering a condescending smile that never quite reached his cold eyes. "Brenda," he had said in that deep, resonant voice that had initially attracted her to him so many years ago, "I sincerely hope you understand that this arrangement is the best possible outcome for both of us. You will be able to start over completely fresh, free from the overwhelming pressures of my high society lifestyle." Brenda raised her eyes from the signed documents, her face completely serene. At 39, she retained the natural, effortless elegance inherited from her mother, a woman from Boston who had dedicated her entire life to teaching classic literature in public schools. Brenda's high cheekbones and clear complexion gave her a commanding air of quiet dignity that absolutely no amount of expensive cosmetics could ever artificially replicate. "I understand your perspective perfectly, Richard," Brenda replied, her voice remaining exceptionally smooth, yet undeniably firm. "After so many long years together, I believe we both truly deserve the absolute freedom to be exactly who we are." Dr. Harrison, a heavily built man of 60 years with a graying mustache, cleared his throat loudly from the head of the polished table. His gold-rimmed glasses caught the overhead light as he shuffled the final paperwork. Beside him, Paige Miller, 45 years old, reviewed her personal notes with deep concentration. Her sharp green eyes reflected the brilliant legal mind that had made her one of the most feared and respected matrimonial attorneys in the entire city, though today she merely played the part of a defeated advocate. "Miss Foster," Dr. Harrison interjected with a heavily formal tone, "you have had ample opportunity to review every single term of this settlement. As you can plainly see, Mr. Sullivan has been extraordinarily generous regarding the temporary alimony and the division of your shared assets." Richard straightened his posture in his seat, puffing out his chest, as if the lawyer's spoken words directly validated his immense magnanimity. Over the past 6 months of bitter negotiations, he had relentlessly insisted that Brenda receive only what he personally deemed a fair fraction of their marital wealth. In his distorted mind, this meant she would be forced to sell the lovely home in Brooklyn Heights, while he retained full ownership of their lavish Manhattan penthouse. "I have reviewed everything quite carefully," Brenda softly replied, turning the thick pages slowly so the lawyers could witness her final acknowledgement. Her discreetly painted red fingernails contrasted sharply against the stark white paper. "It seems to me that these specific terms reflect exactly what Richard considers to be fair and just." There was a subtle, almost undetectable shift in Brenda's tone that caused Paige Miller to glance at her client from the corner of her eye, yet the seasoned attorney maintained her flawless professional mask. During their numerous private strategy sessions preparing for this exact moment, Brenda had displayed an eerie calmness that Paige occasionally found completely unnerving. She never raised her voice, never lost her impeccable composure, and never once demanded a single penny more than Richard was willing to offer. Paige had handled hundreds of messy, tear-filled divorces, and Brenda's peaceful attitude was incredibly unusual for someone who appeared to be losing so much financial security. Richard, however, smugly interpreted this profound silence as absolute resignation. For over a decade, he had systematically built the false narrative that he was the sole economic engine driving their marriage. When they first met at a corporate networking event at the Plaza Hotel 12 years ago, Brenda was working as an international operations coordinator, a job she rarely discussed in great detail. Richard, conversely, was already a regional director for a massive business consulting firm, managing multi-million-dollar accounts for some of the most influential corporations in the country. "I fondly remember the very night we first met," Richard suddenly remarked, flashing a nostalgic smile that felt entirely rehearsed and devoid of genuine warmth. "You were always so incredibly ambitious back then. But ambition without the right elite contacts, without the proper corporate experience? Well, you already know exactly how those sad stories usually end." Brenda did not offer an immediate response. Her slender fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic beat against the table as she mentally revisited that initial conversation from 12 years ago. Richard had been undeniably charming, boasting loudly about his luxurious business trips, the monumental financial decisions he made daily, and the exclusive, invitation-only restaurants where he dined with high-profile clients. Brenda, on the other hand, had only briefly mentioned her own employment without diving into the specific operational details. By that time in her life, she had already learned that in certain fragile, male-dominated circles, being excessively specific about her massive corporate responsibilities could be highly counterproductive. Ambition, Brenda slowly repeated, letting the heavy word roll off her tongue, as if tasting its bitter irony. Yes, I suppose I had plenty of that. The real question is whether ambition without a solid foundation is actually ambition, or if it is simply a foolish illusion. Richard erupted into loud laughter, a booming sound that filled the quiet room as though she had just delivered a brilliantly witty joke. That is my classic Brenda, always acting so deeply philosophical, Richard chuckled, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. In the real world, my dear, undeniable financial results always speak for themselves. The tangible results Richard constantly referred to were painfully evident to anyone who had known the couple over the past decade. They lived in an exclusive, highly desirable neighborhood, vacationed in exotic international destinations twice a year, and Richard proudly drove a top-tier luxury sedan that he meticulously upgraded every 2 years. According to the carefully manicured official story Richard fed their social circle, Brenda had willingly quit her modest job to fully support his soaring career shortly after their lavish wedding. The hidden reality was vastly more complex, yet Brenda had deliberately allowed his simplified, ego-stroking version of their lives to flourish unchallenged. During the early years of their marriage, whenever Richard introduced her at high society galas as his devoted housewife, Brenda had initially attempted to correct the blatant misinformation. However, those gentle corrections inevitably morphed into incredibly uncomfortable conversations on the car ride home. Those uncomfortable conversations quickly escalated into explosive arguments, ending with Richard bitterly accusing her of trying to compete with his success instead of supporting him. Gradually, Brenda learned that it was infinitely easier to just smile politely and subtly change the subject whenever inquisitive guests asked about her daily activities. Richard confidently interpreted her strategic silence as absolute confirmation that he had been entirely correct from the very beginning. He genuinely believed Brenda desperately needed his financial stability, and he heroically provided it. Now, at the bitter end of their union, this deeply flawed interpretation had crystallized into the embarrassingly unequal division of assets sitting right in front of them. "Dr. Harrison," Brenda said calmly, turning her attention to her husband's attorney, "I have a minor question regarding the strict confidentiality clause." The older lawyer nervously adjusted his gold glasses and scrambled to find the corresponding page in the thick stack of legal documents. "Of course, Miss Foster. The clause simply dictates that neither party may ever make public statements regarding the intimate details of the marriage or the specific reasons for this divorce. It is merely a mutual protection for both of your professional reputations," Dr. Harrison explained smoothly. Richard nodded with absolute approval. "It is incredibly important to keep these sensitive matters entirely private, Brenda. My elevated position at the consulting firm requires the utmost discretion." Brenda quietly studied the printed text for a long moment. The restrictive clause had been Richard's brilliant idea, presented as a noble way to shield them both from any potential public scandal. However, Brenda knew the absolute truth. His real motivation was solely to protect the flawless image he had constructed of himself as a wildly successful businessman who maintained a perfectly traditional, stable family life without any messy complications. "It seems perfectly reasonable to me," Brenda finally agreed. "Maintaining discretion has always been highly valued in my family." That was another fundamental aspect of her life that Richard had consistently misunderstood throughout their entire marriage. Brenda came from a solid middle-class family in Boston, but certainly not the impoverished background he had arrogantly assumed. Her parents were highly educated, exceptionally hard-working people. Her mother was a brilliant literature professor, and her father was a dedicated civil engineer who managed massive state infrastructure projects. They had taught Brenda the immense value of living quietly and discreetly, not out of any economic insecurity, but out of a deep-seated moral principle. Richard's mobile phone suddenly vibrated aggressively against the polished wood table, displaying a text message that Brenda easily read from the corner of her eye. It was from his executive assistant, eagerly reminding him of a crucial lunch meeting with potential wealthy investors scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Richard had intentionally scheduled the final divorce signing for this morning, fully planning to celebrate his newfound liberation with a lucrative business lunch. It was exactly the kind of arrogant symbolism he absolutely adored, officially closing one outdated chapter of his life just in time to aggressively open another, far more profitable one. Well, Richard sighed, checking his luxury watch again. We are completely finished here. I have a very important meeting to attend this afternoon. Paige Miller looked directly at Brenda with a highly questioning expression. During all their private consultations, Brenda had sworn she was completely satisfied with these terrible settlement terms. But Paige had more than enough legal experience to know when something felt fundamentally wrong. Brenda was clearly a highly intelligent, exceptionally educated woman, yet she was calmly accepting a financial arrangement that would seemingly leave her in a significantly inferior economic position compared to what she had enjoyed during the marriage. Brenda, Paige asked softly, leaning in close, are you absolutely certain that these final terms seem appropriate to you? Once we officially sign and file these papers, making any future changes will be nearly impossible. Brenda smiled for the very first time during the entire agonizing meeting. It was a remarkably small, yet profoundly genuine smile that beautifully illuminated her elegant face. I am completely certain, Paige. In fact, I am quite anxious to get this over with. Richard sat up straight, visibly thrilled by her compliant words. That is exactly the right attitude to have. Look, Brenda, I know this might seem incredibly difficult right now, but we both know deep down that we made the right choice. You will eventually find a brand new path, something much more appropriate for your limited circumstances. Brenda picked up the heavy fountain pen, uncapping it in one smooth, practiced motion. Her steady hands did not tremble in the slightest. Her rhythmic breathing remained perfectly regular, and her dark eyes stayed intensely focused on the binding contract. She signed her name on every required page, with a sweeping, incredibly confident calligraphy that she had perfected over years of authorizing massive corporate documents. While Brenda signed, Richard began tapping his fingers against the table, with a rapidly growing sense of victorious satisfaction. This had been an exhaustingly long, occasionally tedious legal process, but it was finally reaching its ultimate, logical conclusion. Brenda would receive just enough money to settle modestly in some quiet suburb, perhaps moving back to Boston to live near her aging parents. Meanwhile, he would be totally free to relentlessly continue building his consulting empire without the annoying complications of a stale marriage that had ceased being advantageous to him years ago. You know, Richard mused aloud as Brenda finished the final signatures, I have always truly admired your ability to be perfectly practical. A lot of highly emotional women in your exact situation would have made this process vastly more complicated and painful. Brenda glanced up briefly from the paperwork. Unnecessary complication rarely improves a bad situation, Richard. I always prefer clean, efficient solutions. It was the absolute truth. During their 12 years of marriage, Brenda had consistently avoided creating useless domestic drama. When Richard came home late without a single valid explanation, she simply ate her dinner in peace. When he canceled their weekend plans to attend fake work emergencies that inevitably turned out to be golf outings or social networking events, Brenda smoothly reorganized her own hidden schedule without uttering a single complaint. when he arrogantly boasted about his professional triumphs at dinner parties, completely ignoring her essential contributions to his domestic stability. She just smiled and politely changed the subject. Richard had blindly interpreted this graceful conduct as solid proof that Brenda was naturally submissive, the perfect ideal wife who intuitively understood her lesser place in the grand hierarchy of their relationship. What he never realized was that Brenda merely chose her battles with lethal precision. Brenda set the pen down with a soft click that echoed loudly in the silent room. Richard immediately began clapping his hands together. It was a slow, deliberate, mocking applause that heavily filled the tense space between them. "Bravo!" he cheered with a massive, arrogant grin. "Bravo to the both of us. This is exactly how civilized adults handle their minor differences." The uncomfortable applause dragged on for several awkward seconds. Paige Miller frowned deeply at the tasteless exhibition, maintaining her strict professional glare. Dr. Harrison looked incredibly embarrassed, but quickly gathered the signed documents with practiced efficiency. Brenda simply sat there, observing Richard with an incredibly calm expression that revealed absolutely zero pain or sorrow. "Thank you for the lovely applause," Brenda finally whispered, her voice keeping the exact same even tone she had maintained all morning. "Though I seriously wonder if it is truly appropriate to cheer for the death of a 12-year marriage." Richard shrugged his broad shoulders, completely unapologetic for his insensitive display. "Endings can be wonderful celebrations too, Brenda, especially when they fling open the heavy doors to brilliant new beginnings." Brenda nodded slowly, reaching down to retrieve her simple black leather handbag from the carpeted floor. It was an elegant yet highly understated purse, the kind that might belong to any ordinary middle-class office worker in New York. Richard had watched her carry it for years, without ever caring about what massive secrets it held inside. "You are completely right about new beginnings," Brenda stated while standing up smoothly. Her graceful movements were completely unhurried, radiating the quiet confidence of a woman who controlled all the time in the world. "Though I suppose we define a new beginning in vastly different ways." Paige Miller immediately began outlining the specific legal steps required for the impending property transfers, detailing the strict timeline for the alimony payments Richard would provide over the next 6 months. Brenda listened with polite attention, occasionally asking sharp questions that proved she fully comprehended every tiny legal aspect of their binding agreement. Richard, meanwhile, was already totally checked out, his greedy mind solely focused on his upcoming 2 o'clock meeting with Charles Vincent. "Do you need me to drive you somewhere?" Richard asked carelessly as Brenda walked toward the exit. It was a shallow question asked out of sheer habit, rather than any genuine human concern. The afternoon traffic heading toward the Upper East Side is absolutely terrible right now. Brenda paused in the heavy doorway and turned her head to look at him one last time. "I appreciate the offer, Richard, but I already have my transportation perfectly arranged." There was a strange, powerful undertone in her voice that Richard could not quite decipher. It certainly was not the trembling voice of a defeated woman facing an impoverished, highly uncertain future. It sounded exactly like someone stepping onto a throne. They exited the towering building together, but the moment they crossed the massive glass doors, their paths permanently diverged. Richard walked arrogantly toward the VIP parking garage, where his silver luxury sedan awaited him. Brenda, however, walked in the total opposite direction, heading away from the busy taxi stand. The law office was strategically located near the waterfront, adjacent to a highly exclusive private heliport and executive transit lounge used by billionaires. Richard unlocked his vehicle, casually noticing that Brenda was nowhere near the yellow cabs. He glanced over his shoulder and watched her approach a heavily guarded security checkpoint. Only when she flashed a premium identification card to the armed guards did he realize she was entering the elite aviation terminal. Richard frowned deeply in his luxury car, foolishly assuming his ex-wife had taken a wrong turn due to the immense emotional trauma of the divorce. He considered honking to correct her mistake, but arrogantly decided she was old enough to navigate the city alone. He turned on his powerful air conditioning, eager to arrive fresh for his real estate lunch. As he slowly merged into the busy street, he kept one eye on the private terminal out of mild, nagging curiosity. Suddenly, he slammed on his brakes so violently that the angry driver behind him laid on the horn. Through the wrought iron gates, Richard watched Brenda confidently climbing the polished stairs of a massive, state-of-the-art private jet, painted a crisp white and navy blue. A fully uniformed senior pilot stood at the heavy cabin door, respectfully saluting Brenda as she approached. Richard watched in absolute paralyzed shock as they exchanged a warm, highly familiar greeting before she disappeared into the luxurious aircraft. He sat frozen in the middle of the road for several agonizing minutes, desperately trying to force his logical brain to comprehend the impossible scene. Perhaps she had taken a desperate job as a flight attendant to pay her upcoming bills, or maybe she was acting as a low-level assistant to some wealthy corporate traveler. The third terrifying possibility, that Brenda was the actual highly respected owner of the multi-million-dollar aircraft, seemed far too ridiculous for his fragile ego to even entertain. The roaring sound of the massive jet engines spooling up violently snapped him out of his spiraling thoughts. Richard watched helplessly as the beautiful aircraft began its slow taxi toward the private runway. His cellular phone began ringing loudly, completely breaking his intense concentration. It was Charles Vincent, enthusiastically confirming their lunch meeting and asking if Richard could arrive 15 minutes early to review the lucrative construction blueprints. Richard mechanically confirmed he would be there, but his own voice sounded hollow and impossibly distant. Driving toward the upscale restaurant, he could not erase the powerful image of Brenda boarding that private jet, with the commanding authority of a seasoned queen. Charles Vincent was already seated comfortably when Richard finally arrived at the lavish restaurant overlooking Central Park. Charles, a distinguished man of 50 years with silver hair, radiated the quiet, immense confidence that only comes from decades of total dominance in the luxury real estate market. "Richard, my good friend," Charles beamed, standing up to aggressively shake his hand. "You look a million miles away. Is everything perfectly fine with your messy legal affairs?" Richard forced a fake smile and grabbed a leather-bound menu. "Everything is completely resolved, Charles. I deeply apologize if I seem a little distracted today. It has been a genuinely fascinating morning. Divorces are brutal," Charles nodded sympathetically. "But now you are totally free to conquer the business world without a nagging anchor pulling you down." Those were the exact toxic words Richard usually loved to hear, yet they provided absolutely zero comfort today. His mind kept forcefully dragging him back to the pristine tarmac, visualizing Brenda walking with an aura of total invincibility. "Tell me all about the new luxury development in the Hamptons," Richard deflected, desperately forcing his brain to focus on the lucrative contract. "What specific type of high-end infrastructure are you wealthy investors currently considering?" Charles enthusiastically unrolled a series of massive architectural blueprints right across the dining table. The elite project was incredibly ambitious, featuring a private golf course, an exclusive marina, and dedicated landing pads for executive helicopters and private jets. "The most incredibly complicated part of this entire project," Charles explained seriously, "is that our billionaire clients demand absolute perfection. They absolutely must be able to fly privately from Manhattan directly to the elite resort without a single delay. We desperately need a flawless partnership with a highly reputable aviation firm. Do you happen to know any elite private aviation companies we could partner with?" The innocent question hit Richard right in the stomach like a heavy bowling ball. "No," he choked out. "I have absolutely zero personal experience in the exclusive aviation sector." Charles looked incredibly surprised. "Really? I foolishly assumed a man of your immense corporate stature would use private jets constantly. Time is massive money, Richard." The agonizing meeting dragged on for 2 excruciating hours. Even as Richard mechanically recited brilliant engineering specifications and highly complex project timelines, his deeply troubled mind kept returning to the baffling mystery of Brenda. How could a woman who drove a 5-year-old economy car possess absolute access to the highest tier of global luxury travel? Later that afternoon, consumed by a burning, obsessive curiosity, Richard desperately called Paige Miller. "Miss Miller," he stammered into the phone, "I sincerely apologize for the massive intrusion, but I must ask you a highly unusual question. Did Brenda recently secure a low-level job in the private aviation sector?" There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the line. "Mr. Sullivan," Paige finally answered, her voice dripping with freezing corporate ice. "You must fully understand that I cannot ever discuss Miss Foster's private affairs. Your divorce is completely finalized, and any future information must come directly from her." The fierce, protective loyalty in her sharp tone confirmed Richard's darkest fears. Paige knew an earth-shattering secret. For the next 3 days, Richard could barely sleep. His massive ego was slowly crumbling. On Wednesday morning, a powerful industry insider named Michael Harrison unexpectedly called him. "Richard, my friend," Michael practically shouted, "I heard about your recent divorce. Tragic stuff, but listen, I have a massive corporate question for you. Was your ex-wife heavily involved in the aviation industry before you married her?" Richard felt the air completely vanish from his lungs. "Why do you ask, Michael?" "Well," Michael continued excitedly, "I was drinking with some Wall Street heavyweights yesterday, and they mentioned a massive aviation firm called Foster International. They are violently expanding across the globe. The guys were absolutely raving about the company's brilliant female president. Apparently, she just destroyed the competition and secured a massive fleet contract in Washington. Her name is Brenda Foster. Since you two shared a home, I figured you might have the inside track." Richard gripped his mahogany desk so hard, his knuckles turned totally white. Foster? An international aviation empire? He lied to Michael, claiming he only had a vague professional curiosity about her tiny administrative job. After hanging up, Richard frantically called Susan Moore, a ruthless investigative business journalist. "Susan, I desperately need deep corporate registry information on an enterprise called Foster International. Can you pull the hidden ownership files?" Susan agreed, sensing a massive story. 10 minutes later, she called back, her voice breathless with sheer shock. "Richard, this is absolutely insane. Foster was incorporated over 15 years ago. The sole majority owner and absolute president of the board is Brenda Foster. The corporation holds heavily verified assets exceeding $200 million, including a massive private fleet of luxury jets and exclusive hangars at both Teterboro and Kennedy airports. She is a total industry titan." Richard collapsed heavily into his expensive office chair, completely devastated. The profound humiliation washed over him in massive, suffocating waves. He vividly remembered all the terrible times he had arrogantly lectured Brenda about basic corporate economics, treating her like a clueless child while she politely nodded. She had not been nodding in submission. She had been silently pitying his fragile, massive ignorance. On Thursday morning, driven by pure masochistic desperation, Richard drove his luxury car to the massive Foster hangar in New Jersey. Standing outside the heavily guarded gates, he watched a small army of mechanics servicing the beautiful blue and white jets. He approached a senior engineer on his coffee break, pretending to be a wealthy corporate client looking for reliable charter services. "Let me tell you something important, sir," the greasy-handed mechanic said with immense pride and deep respect. "You will never find a better-run aviation empire anywhere in this country. Miss Foster is an absolute genius. She understands advanced aeronautical engineering, holds a senior commercial pilot license, and genuinely cares about every single employee. She built this massive empire from the ground up, and we would all gladly walk through blazing fire for her." Richard thanked the man and walked slowly back to his car, completely shattered. He had lived with an extraordinary, world-class visionary for 12 long years, entirely blind to her blinding brilliance simply because his pathetic ego demanded a weak, dependent wife. The crushing professional consequences of his terrible blindness arrived swiftly. On Monday morning, Preston Mitchell, the billionaire transport magnate, brutally cancelled their lucrative consulting contract without any warning. When Richard desperately pressed a mutual colleague for the real reason, the answer destroyed him. "Preston discovered your recent divorce," the colleague whispered nervously. "Brenda Foster secretly owns the majority shares in the exact logistics companies Preston desperately needs for his new mega project. He absolutely refused to risk offending a global powerhouse like Brenda by working with her disgraced ex-husband." Richard realized Brenda's invisible corporate tentacles controlled half the major infrastructure projects in the entire city. She was a silent god among mere mortals. Richard finally gathered the courage to visit Brenda's corporate headquarters. The breathtaking glass building hummed with intense, high-level corporate energy. Grace Harper, Brenda's fiercely loyal executive assistant, escorted the deeply humbled man to the top floor. Brenda sat perfectly positioned behind an enormous desk, finalizing a massive international merger. Richard offered a pathetic, completely broken apology for his years of suffocating arrogance and terrible condescension. Brenda accepted his weak apology with terrifying calmness. "I deliberately chose to keep my massive empire hidden from you, Richard," she explained smoothly. "Early in our marriage, your fragile ego demanded that you be the ultimate provider and the smartest person in the room. I simply chose domestic peace over endless, exhausting conflict." She pointed out the massive window at a sleek jet, preparing for a transatlantic flight. "I needed a supportive partner who could joyfully celebrate my massive victories. Instead, I had a highly insecure competitor who constantly tried to minimize my glorious achievements. So, I built my sprawling empire in total silence." Richard begged for a second chance, practically weeping, but Brenda firmly refused. They had evolved in entirely opposite directions. She valued absolute authenticity, while he valued superficial superiority. She politely dismissed him, noting she had a crucial video conference with the Prime Minister of a European nation in exactly 10 minutes. Richard left the glass tower, finally understanding the true magnitude of the brilliant woman he had foolishly thrown away. 2 long years passed since that fateful, devastating conversation. Inside a bustling downtown office, Richard sat at a modest desk, reviewing sensible, mid-level city planning documents. He had hired a bright young intern named David and an incredibly sharp project manager named Claire. He mentored David with a newfound, gentle patience, explicitly teaching the eager boy to value quiet competence over loud arrogance. Richard had entirely abandoned his pathetic need to dominate every room, finding a genuine, quiet satisfaction in honest, hard work. He often thought of Brenda, feeling a complex mixture of deep sorrow and profound gratitude, knowing that her brutal honesty had saved him from a miserable life of fake superiority. Miles away, standing triumphantly in her newly expanded international terminal, Brenda Foster reviewed a massive global expansion strategy alongside her newest financial partner, Arthur Sterling. The incredibly wealthy British investor praised her flawless, stealthy takeover of the European private aviation market. Brenda merely smiled warmly, thanking her dedicated staff. Her mother called joyfully from Boston, crying happy tears because Brenda's beautiful face was currently featured on the glossy cover of the most prestigious global financial magazine in the world. Brenda felt deeply rooted, incredibly powerful, and entirely at peace. She looked out at the busy runway, remembering the hollow, sarcastic applause Richard had given her in the dark law office so long ago. That pathetic, mocking applause had ultimately marked the beautiful death of a toxic illusion and the glorious birth of 2 entirely authentic lives. She had transformed from a hidden, silenced shadow into an undisputed titan of the sky, completely free from the suffocating demands of an insecure man. The true, lasting applause now came from her fiercely loyal employees, her massive network of international partners, and the quiet, unshakable confidence burning brightly within her own soul. The pain of the past had paved a magnificent, golden runway for her limitless future. She turned back to Arthur Sterling and Grace Harper, ready to conquer the next impossible corporate challenge with absolute grace. Life consistently reveals that the quietest individuals we foolishly underestimate often hold the most profound lessons for our own personal growth. True power never requires a loud stage, demanding constant external validation. Instead, it thrives beautifully in quiet dedication, strategic patience, and an unshakable belief in one's own immense potential. When a person deliberately chooses discretion over flashy ostentation, they build an unassailable foundation of character that absolutely no amount of arrogance can ever tear down. Human relationships can only flourish deeply when both individuals are allowed to stand entirely in their own brilliant light, without ever being forced to cast a dark shadow over the other. The tragic act of constantly shrinking oneself, merely to comfort a partner's fragile insecurities, is a terrible sacrifice that ultimately destroys the soul's magnificent potential. Real love and genuine respect absolutely demand that we joyfully celebrate our partner's soaring victories, as if they were exactly our own, rather than viewing their beautiful success as a toxic threat to our own fragile ego. Sometimes, the most painful endings are precisely the powerful catalysts required to aggressively force us out of our blinding illusions and step boldly into our most authentic, brilliant selves. Embracing true humility allows us to finally recognize the quiet, massive empires being diligently built right beside us. Ultimately, the greatest measure of true success is not the deafening volume of the fleeting applause we receive from others, but the deep, quiet peace we feel when we know we are living our most authentic, completely undisguised life.